September 14th, 1971, 6:23 a.m., Georgetown, Washington, D.C. The coffee pot clicks off automatically, the same time it does every morning. Margaret Holt stands at the kitchen window in her cotton nightgown, watching condensation form on the glass. Outside, the early autumn air carries the smell of wet leaves and car exhaust. Her husband's briefcase sits by the door where he left it last night. Brown leather, brass clasps, a thin layer of dust collecting on the corners. He hasn't touched it in 3 days. The telephone hasn't rung since Sunday. Margaret wraps her fingers around her coffee mug, feeling the ceramic warm her palms. Across the street, a dark sedan idles at the curb, engine running. Same car, same spot, fourth morning in a row. She tells herself it's nothing. Washington is full of government cars, full of men in dark suits who sit and watch things. Her husband works for the Commerce Department. Trade statistics. Import regulations. Nothing worth watching. But the briefcase bothers her. Martin never leaves his briefcase untouched. Every evening, he opens it at the dining table, removes papers, makes notes in the margins with a mechanical pencil. Always mechanical, never wood. The ritual is as fixed as the coffee pot timer. 3 nights now, the briefcase has sat by the door, and Martin has stayed in his study with the door locked, speaking quietly on the telephone in a language that sounds like Russian, but can't be Russian because Martin doesn't speak Russian. The sedan's passenger door opens. A man in a gray suit steps onto the sidewalk, adjusts his tie, and looks directly at her window. Margaret steps back instinctively, coffee sloshing against the mug's rim. When she looks again, the man is walking away, but his gaze has left something in the air, a frequency she can almost hear. She crosses to the briefcase. The brass clasps are cool under her thumbs. Inside, she knows she'll find trade reports, customs forms, the mundane architecture of Martin's professional life. But her hands pause. In 14 years of marriage, she has never opened this briefcase without permission. Upstairs, the shower turns on. Martin's footsteps creak across the bedroom floor. Margaret releases the clasps and returns to the window. The sedan is gone. In its place, just an empty stretch of curb and the morning shadows growing shorter as the sun climbs over the row houses of Georgetown. Something is wrong, but she doesn't yet know that wrong is too small a word for what's coming. The official file on Martin Holt reads like a bureaucrat's dream. Born 1928 in Baltimore, Maryland. Bachelor's degree in economics from Johns Hopkins, 1949. Master's in international trade from Georgetown University, 1952. Hired by the Department of Commerce in 1953. Assigned to the Bureau of International Commerce in 1957. Security clearance, secret. 15 annual reviews, 15 approvals. 2 commendations for exceptional analysis of Soviet trade patterns. Member of the Chevy, Chase Country Club. Deacon at Georgetown Presbyterian Church. Married to Margaret Ann Holt-Nay Patterson. No children. Tax returns filed on time. Mortgage paid monthly. A man so thoroughly American, he might have been designed by committee. Margaret met him in 1956 at a department mixer in Foggy Bottom. She was 24, working as a secretary in the same building, typing procurement reports and answering phones. Martin approached her during the cocktail hour, introducing himself with the careful formality of a man who had memorized the social script. He asked about her work, listened intently, remembered her name when they met again the following week in the cafeteria. He courted her with the patience of an entomologist collecting specimens. Dinner at Old Ebbitt Grill, Sunday walks along the C&O Canal, tickets to the Kennedy Center when it opened. He proposed after 8 months with a half-carat diamond ring and a speech about partnership and stability that made her mother weep. Their life together unfolded with clockwork precision. They bought the Georgetown townhouse in 1959 for $42,000. Martin left for work at 7:15 a.m., returned at 5:45 p.m. Tuesdays he played squash at the club. Thursdays he attended a standing meeting with colleagues. Trade projections, he called it. Saturdays they hosted dinner parties for other Commerce Department families, serving pot roast and discussing interest rates over after-dinner drinks. Margaret maintained the house, volunteered at the church book drive, and gradually accepted that the passionate intensity she'd imagined marriage might contain had been replaced by something more valuable: reliability. She never suspected that reliability was the disguise. What Margaret didn't know, what the Commerce Department's Personnel Security Division didn't know, what the FBI's Washington field office didn't know, was that the man who kissed her goodbye each morning and filled out his weekly timesheet with bureaucratic precision was Senior Lieutenant Alexei Volkov of the KGB's First Chief Directorate, Department Vopt Line F, Executive Action. The KGB had invested 12 years in creating Martin Holt. The operation began in 1959, when Soviet intelligence identified the real Martin Holt, a low-level Commerce Department analyst with no living family, no close friends, and a documented history of clinical depression. The real Martin Holt died in a carefully staged automobile accident outside Bethesda on March 8, 1959. His body was cremated before anyone could examine it closely. 3 weeks later, Alexei Volkov arrived in Washington with Martin Holt's social security number, his employment records, and a legend so thoroughly backstopped that even Margaret Patterson, who would become his wife 7 months later, noticed nothing unusual. Volkov had trained for this role at School 101 near Moscow, where the KGB maintained a perfect replica of an American suburb. For 18 months, he lived in a fabricated American environment, shopping at a fake supermarket, attending a fake Presbyterian church, practicing small talk about baseball scores and weather patterns. He learned to drink coffee instead of tea, to prefer his steak medium rare, to say restroom instead of toilet. He studied the real Martin Holt's handwriting until he could forge it unconsciously. He memorized the layout of Georgetown, the bureaucratic hierarchy of the Commerce Department, the social rituals of Washington dinner parties. The marriage to Margaret was tactical. A single man raised questions. A married man with a pleasant wife, a mortgage, and a routine was invisible. Margaret was selected because she was unremarkable. Attractive but not beautiful. Intelligent but not intellectual. Sociable but not gregarious. She would anchor his legend without threatening it. Volkov had been instructed to court her, marry her, and maintain the facade for as long as necessary. What the KGB hadn't predicted was that Volkov would fall in love with her. Not immediately, not dramatically, but over the years, in the accumulation of small moments. Margaret laughing at his jokes, Margaret defending him at dinner parties, Margaret falling asleep with her head on his shoulder during Sunday afternoon movies. Something unexpected happened. The man who had been trained to simulate affection began to feel it. The marriage that had been designed as operational security became the one authentic element of his fabricated life. This created problems. Department Vi, where Volkov was assigned, handled wet work, assassinations, sabotage, violent coercion. Between 1960 and 1971, Martin Holt carried out 17 operations on American soil. He poisoned a CIA case officer in Cleveland using thallium-laced vitamins. He staged a car accident that killed an exiled Ukrainian dissident in Chicago. He arranged the disappearance of a Soviet defector in San Francisco. The man's body was never found. Each operation required weeks of surveillance, careful planning, and cold execution. Volkov flew to these cities on Commerce Department business, filed expense reports, and returned to Georgetown with trinkets for Margaret: a miniature cable car from San Francisco, a snow globe from Cleveland, a jar of honey from a farmer's market in Chicago. Margaret kept these gifts on a shelf in the living room, a small museum of Martin's travels. The briefcase was Volkov's mistake. Standard KGB doctrine required that operational materials never be brought into the domestic residence. But Volkov had become sloppy. Over 12 years, the boundaries between his fabricated life and his operational life had blurred. In August 1971, he'd been assigned a complex operation in Washington itself, the elimination of a Pentagon analyst who'd been feeding information to MI6. The target lived in Arlington, just across the Potomac. Volkov had surveillance photos, dosimetric calculations for a radioactive poison, and a detailed timeline in a sealed envelope inside his briefcase. He'd intended to review the materials in his office. Instead, he'd brought them home. For 3 days, he'd left the briefcase untouched, paralyzed by the recognition that operational security and domestic security had finally collided. If Margaret opened the briefcase, the entire legend would collapse. If he didn't complete the operation, Moscow would begin asking questions. He spent those 3 nights locked in his study, speaking with his handlers in Moscow using a burst transmitter hidden in the heating vent, explaining that he needed more time, requesting alternative methods, arguing for delay. Moscow was losing patience. The CIA's counterintelligence staff, meanwhile, was closing in from a different direction. In June 1971, a KGB defector named Oleg Lielin had walked into the British Embassy in London and provided details about Department Vive operations worldwide. Lielin didn't know Volkov's real name or his cover identity, but he described an operative in Washington, mid-40s, fluent English, deep cover, married. The description was vague, but it was something. CIA counterintelligence cross-referenced Lielin's information with unsolved murders and disappearances over the past decade. Patterns emerged. A Commerce Department employee had traveled to Cleveland days before the CIA officer's death. The same employee had been in Chicago during the Ukrainian dissident's disappearance. The same employee had been in San Francisco when the defector vanished. The employee's name was Martin Holt. On September 10th, 1971, FBI surveillance began. The dark sedan outside the Georgetown townhouse belonged to the Bureau's Washington field office. Inside were 2 agents with cameras, listening equipment, and instructions to observe, but not approach. They watched Martin Holt leave for work each morning, return each evening, and largely ignore his briefcase. They watched Margaret Holt through the kitchen window, drinking coffee, washing dishes, living the ordinary life of a government wife. What neither the FBI, nor Margaret, nor even Volkov himself fully understood was that the real crisis wasn't the briefcase, or the surveillance, or even the Pentagon analyst in Arlington. The crisis was that Alexei Volkov, after 12 years of pretending to be Martin Holt, no longer knew which identity was the performance and which was real. The first tangible evidence arrived not from FBI surveillance, but from a filing cabinet in the Commerce Department's basement. On September 15th, 1971, a junior clerk named Patricia Simmons was reorganizing personnel files when she noticed a discrepancy. Martin Holt's employment file contained 2 versions of his security clearance application from 1953. The forms were identical except for one detail: the signature. The loop of the M in Martin was different, slightly wider in one version, compressed in the other. Simmons brought this to her supervisor, who dismissed it as a filing error. But Simmons had an uncle who worked in Army intelligence, and over Sunday dinner, she mentioned the signatures. The uncle made a phone call. The phone call reached the CIA's counterintelligence staff on Monday morning. James Jesus Angleton, the CIA's legendary and paranoid chief of counterintelligence, had been hunting Soviet moles for 2 decades. He destroyed careers based on thinner evidence than mismatched signatures. Within hours, a team from Langley descended on the Commerce Department with a subpoena. They seized Martin Holt's entire personnel file, his expense reports, his travel vouchers, his handwritten memos. Everything was photographed, cataloged, and transported to a secure facility in McLean, Virginia. Forensic document examiners compared signatures across 18 years of paperwork. The results were unambiguous. The handwriting belonged to 2 different people. Before March 1959, the signatures showed one pattern. After March 1959, a different pattern emerged. The change was subtle, the angle of certain letters, the pressure applied to downstrokes, but it was consistent. The man who'd been signing as Martin Holt since 1959 was not the man who'd signed as Martin Holt before 1959. Angleton convened an emergency meeting in his office, a windowless room thick with cigarette smoke and paranoia. Present were 2 FBI liaisons, 3 counterintelligence officers, and a Department of Defense representative. Angleton spread the handwriting analysis across his desk and delivered his assessment in his characteristically elliptical manner. "We have a ghost. The question is whether the ghost is haunting us or we're haunting the ghost." The FBI wanted to arrest Martin Holt immediately. Angleton disagreed. If they arrested him without understanding the full scope of his network, they might alert other operatives. Better to watch, to wait, to let the ghost reveal himself. The FBI argued about legal exposure, about the risk of another assassination, about the political nightmare if the press discovered that a KGB officer had been living in Georgetown for 12 years. Angleton overruled them all. "We don't arrest ghosts," he said. "We exorcise them." The exorcism began with telephone taps. Every call to and from the Holt residence was recorded, transcribed, analyzed. The FBI expanded surveillance. More agents, more cameras, 24-hour coverage. They examined the Holt's bank records, utility bills, credit card statements. They interviewed neighbors, colleagues, anyone who'd interacted with Martin Holt. They built a timeline of his movements over 12 years, cross-referencing with unsolved murders, unexplained disappearances, suspicious deaths. The picture that emerged was chilling. Martin Holt, or whoever he really was, had traveled extensively, always on official Commerce Department business, always with legitimate documentation. But his travels correlated with 17 deaths. The statistical probability of coincidence was effectively 0. September 18th, a cryptanalysis team at Fort Meade intercepted a burst transmission originating from Georgetown. The signal lasted 0.7 seconds, too fast for real-time decryption, but the frequency and encryption method matched known KGB patterns. Triangulation placed the source within a 3-block radius of the Holt residence. Electronic surveillance teams began sweeping nearby buildings, searching for transmitting equipment. Margaret Holt, meanwhile, was living in a state of mounting unease she couldn't articulate. Martin had become distant, distracted. He barely touched his dinner. He spent hours in his study with the door locked. On September 16th, she'd knocked and asked if everything was all right. He'd opened the door just wide enough to look at her, his face pale, eyes shadowed. "Everything's fine," he'd said. "Just work stress." But his hand on the doorframe was trembling. Margaret began noticing other details. The dark sedans on their street. Sometimes one, sometimes two. The man in the gray suit who seemed to be trimming hedges across the street for hours without making progress. The mail arriving late, envelopes slightly crumpled, as though they'd been opened and resealed. On September 19th, she mentioned this to Martin over breakfast. He looked up from his untouched eggs, studied her face for a long moment, then said, "You're imagining things." "Am I?" "Yes." But that afternoon, she found him in the living room, holding the jar of honey he'd brought back from Chicago. He was turning it over in his hands, staring at the label as though it contained some message he'd forgotten how to read. "Martin?" she said. He set the jar down carefully, aligned it precisely with the others on the shelf. "Do you ever wish," he said slowly, "that you could go back and make different choices?" "What do you mean?" "Nothing. Never mind." That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay beside Martin in the darkness, listening to his breathing. Shallow, irregular. At 2:14 a.m., she heard him get up, heard his footsteps in the hallway, heard the study door close. She waited 10 minutes, then followed. The study door was locked, but light showed beneath it. She pressed her ear to the wood and heard Martin's voice, low and urgent, speaking in what was definitely Russian. The language was unmistakable now. The soft consonants, the rolling R's, the cadence entirely foreign to English. Margaret stepped back from the door as though it had burned her. She returned to bed and lay motionless, her mind racing through possible explanations. Martin was taking Russian lessons and didn't want to tell her. Martin was helping someone at work translate documents. Martin was watching a foreign film with the volume low. None of these explanations explained the trembling hand on the doorframe or the fear she'd seen in his eyes. The next morning, September 20th, Margaret did something she'd never done before. After Martin left for work, she called the Commerce Department and asked to speak with his supervisor. The receptionist transferred her to a man named Harold Edmonds, who identified himself as the deputy director of the Bureau of International Commerce. "Mrs. Holt," Edmonds said warmly, "what can I do for you?" "I was wondering," Margaret said carefully, "if Martin has been under unusual stress lately. He's been working long hours, and I'm concerned." There was a pause. "Mrs. Holt, your husband hasn't been in the office for 3 days. We assumed he was ill." Margaret's hand tightened on the telephone receiver. "He's been leaving every morning at the usual time." Another pause, longer this time. "Mrs. Holt, I think you and I should speak in person. Are you available this afternoon?" "Yes. I'll send a car." The car arrived at 2 p.m. It wasn't a Commerce Department vehicle. It was an unmarked sedan driven by a man who showed her a badge too quickly for her to read the name. He drove her not to the Commerce Department building, but to an office complex in McLean, Virginia. The sign outside read Consultancy Services International, a name so generic it could only be fake. Inside, Margaret was led to a conference room where 3 men waited. One was Harold Edmonds. The other 2 introduced themselves as federal investigators. They asked her to sit. They asked if she wanted coffee. She declined. "Mrs. Holt," Edmonds began, "we need to ask you some questions about your husband." "What kind of questions?" One of the investigators leaned forward. His nameplate read, Special Agent Carlson. He had the face of a man who'd stopped being surprised by human deception decades ago. "How well do you know Martin Holt?" "He's my husband. We've been married for 14 years. "What did he tell you about his background?" "He grew up in Baltimore. His parents died in a car accident when he was 20. He went to Johns Hopkins, then Georgetown." "Did he ever mention family? Friends from childhood? Anyone who could verify his past?" Margaret felt the first cold thread of real fear. "No. He said he was an only child. His parents didn't have siblings." Carlson exchanged a glance with the other investigator. "Mrs. Holt, we have reason to believe that the man you know as Martin Holt is not who he claims to be." The room tilted slightly. "I don't understand." "We believe your husband is a foreign intelligence operative. Soviet, specifically." Margaret laughed. A short, sharp sound without humor. "That's insane. Martin works in trade statistics. He plays squash. He's a deacon at our church." "The man you know as Martin Holt assumed that identity in 1959, Carlson said. "The real Martin Holt died that year. We have evidence suggesting the man you married is actually a Soviet operative named Alexei Volkov." The name hung in the air like smoke. Margaret stared at Carlson, then at Edmonds, then at the third investigator, whose name she'd already forgotten. "You're saying my husband is a Russian spy?" "We're saying your husband is a Russian assassin." The room swayed more dramatically now. Margaret gripped the edge of the table. "I don't believe you." Carlson opened a folder and removed a series of photographs. He laid them on the table, one by one. They showed Martin, or someone who looked exactly like Martin, in Cleveland, Chicago, San Francisco. In several photos, he was following people. In one, he was handing a package to a woman Margaret didn't recognize. "We've connected your husband to 17 deaths," Carlson said quietly. "All of them people who were problematic for Soviet intelligence. all of them occurring in cities your husband visited on Commerce Department business. Margaret pushed the photographs away. No, you're wrong. Martin wouldn't, he couldn't. Mrs. Holt. Carlson's voice was gentler now. We need your help. We need you to go home and act as though nothing has changed. We need you to keep your husband calm while we determine the full extent of his network. You want me to spy on him. We want you to protect yourself and help us prevent further killings. Margaret stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. I want to go home. Mrs. Holt, now! They drove her back to Georgetown in silence. As the car pulled up to her townhouse, Carlson handed her a business card. If you need us, he said, for any reason, call this number, day or night. Margaret took the card without looking at it and got out of the car. Inside the house, everything looked exactly as she'd left it. The breakfast dishes still in the sink, the jar of honey still on the shelf, Martin's briefcase still by the door, untouched. She stood in the entryway, staring at the briefcase, and realized that everything she believed about her life had just been revealed as either a lie or a delusion. The only question was which. At 5:47 p.m., Martin came home. He opened the door with his key, stepped inside, and stopped when he saw Margaret standing in the living room, still wearing her coat, still holding the business card. You're home early, he said. She looked at him, at this man she'd slept beside for 14 years, whose coffee preferences she knew, whose laugh lines she'd memorized. She looked at him and tried to see the stranger underneath. Who are you? She said. Martin closed the door carefully behind him. What do you mean? The Commerce Department says you haven't been to work in 3 days. Federal investigators showed me photographs. They told me your real name is Alexei Volkov. Martin's face did something complicated. A series of micro-expressions so rapid they were almost subliminal. Fear, calculation, resignation, something else Margaret couldn't identify. When he spoke, his voice was very quiet. Let me explain. Are you Russian? A pause. Then, yes. The single word detonated in the space between them. Margaret stepped backward, her shoulder hitting the doorframe. Have you been lying to me for 14 years? Yes and no. That's not an answer. Martin moved toward her slowly, as though approaching a frightened animal. I was sent here to be Martin Holt. I was given a mission. I followed my orders. But Margaret... He stopped, his hands opening in a gesture of helplessness. I didn't expect you. What does that mean? It means they ordered me to marry you, but they didn't order me to love you. Margaret felt tears on her face, without realizing she'd started crying. How many people have you killed? Martin's expression closed like a shutter. I can't answer that. How many? Margaret, how many? It doesn't matter. She threw the business card at him. It fluttered between them like a wounded bird. Federal investigators are watching this house right now. They're going to arrest you. They're going to put you on trial. They're going to execute you. Martin bent down, picked up the card, read it. When he looked up, his face showed something Margaret had never seen before. Not fear, but sorrow. Deep, irrevocable sorrow. I know, he said. Then why did you come home? Because I wanted to see you one more time. The simplicity of this statement broke something in Margaret. She sagged against the doorframe, her legs suddenly unreliable. I don't even know who I'm talking to. I don't know your real name. I don't know where you're from. I don't know anything. My name is Alexei, he said quietly. I'm from Leningrad. My father was a factory worker. My mother taught school. I was recruited by the KGB when I was 21. I've been in this country since 1959. Everything else I told you about myself was a lie except for one thing. What? I love you. Margaret wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. That's not enough. I know. They stood there in the fading afternoon light, two people who'd shared a bed for 14 years and were now separated by a distance too vast to measure. Outside, the dark sedan idled at the curb. Inside, the coffee pot sat cold and empty on the kitchen counter. What happens now? Margaret said finally. Alexei looked at his briefcase by the door. I was supposed to complete one more operation. A Pentagon analyst. I have everything I need in that briefcase. Photos, poison, timeline. If I don't do it, Moscow will know something's wrong. If I do it, the FBI will arrest me in the act. So you're trapped? Yes. Why did you bring the briefcase home? Alexei smiled, a sad, broken expression. Because I was tired of keeping it separate. Because I wanted to stop pretending that Martin Holt and Alexei Volkov were different people. He paused. Because I was hoping you'd find it, and open it, and the decision would be taken out of my hands. Margaret stared at him. You wanted me to expose you. I wanted it to be over. The telephone rang, shrill and sudden. They both flinched. Margaret looked at Alexei. He nodded. She picked up the receiver. Mrs. Holt, Carlson's voice said. Is your husband home? Yes. Is he armed? Margaret looked at Alexei. Are you armed? No. He says no. Mrs. Holt, we're going to enter the house in 2 minutes. I need you to go upstairs to your bedroom and lock the door. Can you do that? Yes. Do it now. Margaret hung up. She looked at Alexei one more time, memorizing his face. The face she thought she'd known, now revealed as a mask over features she'd never truly seen. I'm sorry, he said. So am I. She turned and walked upstairs. Behind her, she heard the front door open. Heard voices. Heard Alexei say something in Russian. She went into the bedroom, closed the door, locked it. She sat on the bed and waited. Downstairs there was a brief commotion. Footsteps, instructions, the metallic click of handcuffs. Then silence. Margaret looked at her hands. They were shaking. She thought about the jar of honey from Chicago, about Sunday afternoon movies, about 14 years of breakfasts and dinners and conversations about nothing important. She thought about the man who'd kissed her goodbye each morning and who'd been planning murders while she typed grocery lists. She thought about love and lies and which was more real. The bedroom door remained locked for 3 hours. By the time she opened it, the house was empty except for 2 federal agents who informed her that she'd need to answer more questions, that she might be called to testify, that her life was about to become very complicated. Margaret nodded at everything they said. Then she walked downstairs, picked up the brown leather briefcase with brass clasps, and opened it. Inside were surveillance photos of a man she didn't recognize, a sealed vial of something that might have been medicine or poison, and a handwritten note in Russian. She couldn't read the words, but she understood their significance. This was the machinery of death her husband had carried through her home. She closed the briefcase and set it back by the door. Then she made coffee, because even when the world collapsed, some rituals persisted. The trial of Alexei Volkov began on April 3, 1972, in a secure courtroom at the Eastern District of Virginia. The proceedings were closed to the public. Margaret attended every day, sitting in the gallery, watching the man she'd thought was her husband describe operations she could barely comprehend. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. They brought forensic handwriting analysis, travel records, testimony from CIA officers about unsolved murders. They introduced the briefcase, the poison, the surveillance photos. They explained how Volkov had eliminated 17 people over 12 years, how he'd used his Commerce Department cover to move freely across the country, how he'd maintained a fabricated identity with such precision that even his wife hadn't suspected. The defense argued that Volkov had been acting under orders, that he was a soldier following commands, that he deserved to be treated as a prisoner of war rather than a criminal. The judge was unpersuaded. On June 12, 1972, Alexei Volkov was convicted on 17 counts of murder and 1 count of espionage. He showed no reaction when the verdict was read. Margaret was called to testify only once. The prosecutor asked her to confirm basic facts about her marriage, about Volkov's daily routine, about anything suspicious she might have noticed. She answered truthfully. She'd noticed nothing. She'd been married to a stranger for 14 years and never knew it. On cross-examination, the defense attorney asked her one question. "Did your husband ever harm you?" "No," Margaret said. "Did he ever threaten you?" "No." "Did he, in any way you could observe, demonstrate affection toward you?" Margaret looked across the courtroom at Alexei. He was staring at his hands, his face expressionless. "Yes," she said. The defense attorney nodded. No further questions. Sentencing was scheduled for August. The government sought the death penalty for all 17 murders. The defense argued for life imprisonment. Legal scholars debated whether Volkov could be executed under the espionage statutes, or whether he should be treated as an enemy combatant. Margaret didn't attend the sentencing hearing. By then, she'd moved out of the Georgetown townhouse, sold the furniture, donated the clothes, thrown away the trinkets from Martin's travels. She kept only one item, the jar of honey from Chicago. She couldn't explain why. On August 19th, 1972, the judge sentenced Alexei Volkov to death by electrocution. The sentence was to be carried out at the Virginia State Penitentiary. But Volkov never made it to the penitentiary. On September 2nd, 1972, while being transported from the courthouse to a holding facility, the prison van carrying Volkov was ambushed on Interstate 95 near Fredericksburg, Virginia. 4 men in a separate vehicle forced the van off the road, killed both guards, and extracted Volkov from the back. The entire operation took less than 90 seconds. By the time state police arrived, the attackers were gone. A massive manhunt ensued. The FBI, CIA, and local law enforcement searched for weeks. They found the abandoned vehicle, a stolen panel truck, in a parking lot near Dulles International Airport. They found evidence suggesting Volkov had been smuggled onto a diplomatic flight to Moscow. They found nothing else. Alexei Volkov had vanished. The official investigation concluded that the KGB had orchestrated the rescue, that Volkov had been extracted and returned to the Soviet Union, that he was likely living under a new identity in Moscow or Leningrad. Unofficially, rumors circulated. Some claimed Volkov had been killed by his rescuers to prevent him from revealing more operational details. Others insisted he'd been taken to a CIA black site for interrogation. A few suggested he'd never left the country, that he was living quietly somewhere in America under yet another false identity. Margaret received a visit from Agent Carlson 3 days after the escape. He apologized for the failure, assured her that Volkov posed no threat to her personally, and offered federal protection if she wanted it. She declined. "He won't come back here," she said. "How do you know?" "Because he already said goodbye." Carlson studied her face, then nodded and left. Margaret never saw or heard from Alexei Volkov again. The Volkov case reshaped American counterintelligence operations for the next decade. The Commerce Department underwent a complete security overhaul. The CIA's counterintelligence staff, under Angleton's increasingly paranoid leadership, launched an aggressive campaign to identify other deep-cover Soviet operatives. Dozens of government employees were investigated, many careers were destroyed, and the atmosphere of suspicion became so toxic that productive intelligence work nearly ground to a halt. Angleton himself became consumed by the case. He believed Volkov couldn't have operated alone, that there must be other sleeper agents embedded in American institutions. He spent years chasing leads that led nowhere, seeing conspiracies and coincidences, destroying the careers of innocent people based on circumstantial evidence. In 1974, Angleton was forced into retirement, his legacy permanently tainted by the paranoia that had made him both effective and destructive. The Soviet Union never officially acknowledged Volkov's existence. KGB archives captured after the Cold War contained fragmentary references to an operative named Volkov, or Martin, but nothing definitive. In 1991, A retired KGB officer named Vasily Mitrokhin defected to Britain with thousands of smuggled documents. Among them was a brief notation, Volkov, A.N., Department 5, Washington Operation, 1959 to 1972. Status, terminated. What terminated meant remained unclear. Executed? Killed during the rescue? Retired under a new identity? The answer died with the Soviet Union. For Margaret Holt, the years after the trial were a long, slow process of reconstruction. She changed her name back to Margaret Patterson, moved to Philadelphia, took a job as a librarian at the Free Library. She never remarried. Friends who knew her from this period described her as pleasant, efficient, and intensely private. She declined all interview requests, refused to cooperate with journalists writing about the Volkov case, and maintained absolute silence about her 14-year marriage to a man who never existed. In 1989, a television producer tracked her down and offered substantial money for her story. She declined. In 1994, a true crime author sent her a draft manuscript asking for her input. She returned it unopened. In 2001, after the September 11th attacks renewed public interest in espionage and betrayal, CNN requested an interview. She said no. The one person she did speak with was Dr. Eleanor Marsh, a psychiatrist specializing in trauma and deception. Margaret began seeing Dr. Marsh in 1973 and continued weekly sessions for 18 years. In 2010, after Dr. Marsh's death, her professional papers were donated to the American Psychological Association archives. Among them was a sealed file marked Case Study MP, Betrayal and Identity. The file, opened in accordance with Dr. Marsh's instructions in 2035, contained session notes that provided the only window into Margaret's internal experience of the Volkov years. The notes described a woman struggling not with hatred for her husband, but with something more complicated. The inability to reconcile the man who'd murdered 17 people with the man who'd remembered her birthday every year, who'd held her hand during thunderstorms, who'd learned to make her favorite pasta dish from a recipe in a magazine. She insists both men were real, Dr. Marsh wrote in 1975. She cannot accept that the affection was entirely simulated, but she also cannot accept that a man capable of such affection could commit such acts. The cognitive dissonance is profound. She exists in a state of perpetual uncertainty about everything she experienced. In a later entry from 1982, patient reports recurring dream. She is sitting across from AV at a restaurant. She asks, "Who are you?" He responds, "I don't know." She believes this dream captures the fundamental truth of her marriage, that he became so deeply embedded in his cover identity that he lost access to his original self. She feels, in some perverse way, that this makes them both victims. Margaret Patterson died on March 8, 2019, at age 86, in a care facility in Philadelphia. Her obituary was brief, listing her employment at the Free Library and her volunteer work with literacy programs. It made no mention of her first marriage. She left no children, no immediate family. Her estate, modest but carefully managed, was donated to the International Rescue Committee to support refugees fleeing authoritarian regimes. Her personal effects were minimal: clothing, books, a few photographs from her childhood. There was one item the estate executor found puzzling: a jar of honey, decades old, sealed and preserved, sitting on a shelf in her bedroom closet. The label indicated it had come from a farmer's market in Chicago. The executor threw it away. The true fate of Alexei Volkov remains unknown. Soviet records suggest he returned to Moscow after the 1972 escape, but no definitive proof exists. In 1998, a Russian journalist named Dmitry Kovalev published an article claiming to have interviewed a former KGB officer who'd known Volkov. According to this source, Volkov had indeed returned to the Soviet Union, but had become a liability. He'd been too Americanized, too psychologically compromised by his years in deep cover. He couldn't readjust to Soviet life, couldn't be trusted with new assignments, couldn't forget the woman he'd left behind in Georgetown. In 1974, according to Kovalev's source, Volkov had been quietly eliminated by his own service. His body was cremated. No funeral was held. His name was removed from all records. He became, in death, what he'd been in life, a ghost. The article was never independently verified. Kovalev died in a car accident in 2003, and his research materials were lost. In 2008, a man claiming to be Alexei Volkov contacted the Washington Post via encrypted email. He provided details about the Georgetown operations that were not public knowledge, suggested that he'd been living in Canada under a new identity, and expressed regret for the lives he'd taken. He asked if Margaret Patterson was still alive. The Post's investigative team tried to verify the claim, but couldn't establish the sender's identity. The email address went dead after 3 messages. The Post never published the story. If Alexei Volkov is still alive, he would be 96 years old. If he's alive, he knows that Margaret is not. If he's alive, he lives with the knowledge that he destroyed the one authentic relationship in his fabricated life. If he's alive, he carries the weight of 17 murders and 1 14-year lie. If he's alive. The jar of honey from Chicago, thrown away in 2019, might have been the last physical evidence that the marriage between Margaret Patterson and Alexei Volkov, between a secretary and an assassin, between an American and a Soviet, between 2 people who loved each other despite the lies, had ever existed. But evidence, like memory, eventually disappears. What remains is the question that haunted Margaret for 47 years, the question that Dr. Marsh's notes suggest she never resolved. Can love exist inside a lie, or does the lie poison everything it touches? Margaret believed the answer was both. She believed Alexei truly loved her, and that the love was built on a foundation of absolute deception. She believed that he was a cold-blooded killer and a devoted husband. She believed he was a stranger and the person who knew her best. She believed all of this simultaneously, and it broke something in her that never healed. In 2023, the CIA declassified portions of the Volkov case file under Freedom of Information Act pressure. The documents revealed operational details, the handwriting analysis, the surveillance reports, the intercepted transmissions. They revealed the 17 confirmed kills, the methods used, the identities of the victims. They revealed the escape plan and the likely Soviet involvement. They did not reveal what happened to Alexei Volkov after September 2nd, 1972. The file contained one document that stood out from the operational reports and investigative summaries. It was a letter, handwritten, dated September 20th, 1971, the day Margaret confronted Alexei in their Georgetown living room. The letter had been found in Alexei's study after his arrest. It was addressed to Margaret, but never sent. It had been sealed in an evidence bag for 52 years. The letter read, Margaret, by the time you read this, if you ever do, you'll know who I really am. You'll know what I've done. You'll know that everything I told you about my past was a lie. I won't ask for forgiveness because I don't deserve it. I won't try to explain because there is no explanation that justifies what I've done. But I need you to know one thing, and this is the truth. I was sent to marry you, but I chose to love you. They gave me a mission, and I completed it. They gave me a cover, and I inhabited it. But they didn't give me you. That was mine. That was real. I know you won't believe this. I know that by revealing who I am, I've made everything I said and did suspect, including this letter. I know that love built on lies becomes a lie itself, but it wasn't a lie to me. I don't expect you to understand. I don't expect anything. I just wanted you to know that in a life entirely constructed from deception, you were the one authentic thing. And I'm sorry that I couldn't give you the same. A. The letter was never delivered to Margaret. It remained in the classified file, unknown to her, for her entire life. Whether this makes it more tragic or less is impossible to say. On a shelf in the CIA's museum at Langley, Virginia, there's a small exhibition about Cold War double agents and deep cover operatives. Among the artifacts is a brown leather briefcase with brass clasps. The placard reads, "Briefcase belonging to Soviet operative Alexei Volkov, aka Martin Holt, used to transport operational materials while maintaining cover as a Commerce Department analyst, 1959 to 1971. The briefcase is empty now, of course. The surveillance photos, the poison, the operational notes, all of it has been cataloged and stored in secure archives. What remains is just the container, the shell, the object that Margaret stared at for 3 days in September 1971 while deciding whether to open it and discover the truth. She never opened it. The FBI opened it for her. Sometimes tourists pause at the exhibit, read the placard, and move on. The story of Alexei Volkov and Margaret Holt is just one among many tales of Cold War espionage. Interesting, but not exceptional. Dramatic, but not unique. What they don't see, what the exhibit doesn't mention, what even the declassified files don't fully capture, is the smaller, more human truth that somewhere in Georgetown, for 14 years, a man and a woman had breakfast together every morning, and both of them believed it was real, and one of them was right, and one of them was wrong, and neither of them ever discovered which was which. The coffee pot still exists, probably, in a thrift store somewhere, or a landfill, or someone else's kitchen, brewing coffee for people who have no idea of its history. Objects outlast the stories attached to them. The meanings we assign them disappear, but the objects persist, dumb and mute, carrying secrets they can't reveal to anyone who doesn't already know. Margaret kept the jar of honey until she died. It sat on a shelf in her closet for 48 years, sealed, preserved, unopened. She never explained why she kept it. Dr. Marsh asked several times during their sessions. Margaret would only say, "It reminds me that something sweet came from somewhere terrible." Dr. Marsh interpreted this as a metaphor for the marriage itself, that even within the horror of betrayal, there had been moments of genuine tenderness. Margaret never confirmed or denied this interpretation. The honey is gone now, thrown away by an estate executor who couldn't know its significance. If you could have opened the jar and tasted it, after all those decades, it probably would have crystallized and turned bitter. Honey doesn't last forever, despite the myths, but neither do lies, and neither does love, and neither do the people who carry both. All that remains is the question, which was more real? Martin Holt would have said the love. Alexei Volkov would have said the lie. Margaret Patterson, who lived long enough to understand that they were the same person saying different things, would have said it didn't matter. The truth finally came out, some of it anyway, in declassified documents and investigative reports and museum exhibits. But the truth that Margaret needed, the truth about whether her life had meaning or had been merely a performance for an audience of one, that truth died with her. Outside a townhouse in Georgetown, which is now owned by a young couple who work in finance and know nothing of its history, the morning sun rises the same way it did on September 14th, 1971. Coffee brews in kitchens. People kiss their spouses goodbye. Briefcases sit by doors, waiting to be picked up and carried into the world. And somewhere, maybe, an old man who used to be young, who used to be American, who used to be someone else entirely, wakes up and remembers a woman who didn't know she was married to a ghost. Or maybe he doesn't. Maybe he's dead. Or maybe he's forgotten. Or maybe he's chosen not to remember, because remembering would be unbearable. The only certainty is that the jar of honey from Chicago, the one object that connected Margaret's understanding of her marriage to the reality of what it had been, is gone now. And with it, the last physical proof that love and lies once coexisted in a Georgetown townhouse, where a woman made coffee every morning for a man who wasn't there.